The moment Harlow Sinclair Osei walked through the glass doors of the Fairmont Royal York's grand ballroom, the room didn't stop. But one man did. She felt it before she saw it. That particular stillness, the way a person goes quiet when they've been caught somewhere they thought was safe. She'd spent 3 years learning to read that stillness. She wasn't looking for it tonight. She was looking for the bar. Her escort, Camden Whitmore, placed a hand at the small of her back, not possessively, just steadying, the way he always did when he sensed her tensing before she knew she was tense herself. "You good?" he murmured, lips barely moving. "Fine," she said, and she meant it. Mostly. The gala was for the Meridian Children's Foundation, one of those charity evenings where Bay Street money dressed itself in black tie and told itself it was generous. Every major name in Canadian corporate finance was here. Pemberton Capital, Whitmore Group, the Aldridge Family Trust. The chandeliers were original. The champagne was French. The irony of it all was that Harlow had organized 5 of these events herself, back when she was still Mrs. Harlow Devereux. She wasn't Mrs. Devereux anymore. That name was behind her, along with the house in Forest Hill, the shared investment portfolio. And the years she'd spent building a life with a man who'd decided, somewhere around their 8th anniversary, that he deserved a different kind of life entirely, one that didn't include her. What that life did include was standing 20 feet away in a strapless navy gown, holding a glass of champagne with both hands as though she needed something to anchor herself to the earth. Harlow saw her first, then she saw him. Trent Devereux stood at the far end of the room, near the east windows, and he was already looking at her. His face had gone the kind of blank that only happens when a person's mind is working too hard, too fast. The woman beside him, Siobhan, her name was Siobhan Price, 29 years old, formerly the junior communications director at Devereux Capital, had her hand on his arm and hadn't noticed anything yet. Harlow held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned away. Camden leaned slightly toward her. "Want to leave?" "Absolutely not," she said, and accepted a flute of champagne from a passing server. Trent hadn't always been this version of himself. That was the part that used to keep her awake at night in those first months after, not the betrayal itself. Which was sharp and clean once she finally understood it, but the question of when exactly the man she'd married had been replaced by the man he'd become. Whether she'd missed it happening, or whether there had always been a version of him waiting for the right conditions to emerge. She'd met him at 31, both of them at a financial sector conference in Montreal. He was clever and quick and laughed easily. She was director of strategic partnerships at a mid-size asset management firm, and she'd been the one to introduce him, indirectly, to the Aldridge family, a connection that had launched Devereux Capital from a boutique advisory firm to one of the top independent wealth management houses in English Canada within 4 years. She knew what she'd built. She'd never once held it over him, because she'd done it out of love, and love doesn't keep receipts. She understood that now as a fact, not a wound. The wound had closed. What remained was something harder, clarity. The year things shifted, Trent had started working late with unusual regularity. She hadn't been suspicious, not at first. They were both in demanding careers. She'd been managing the foundation's restructuring on top of her own role at the firm. She'd been tired too. She found out the way a lot of women find out. By accident, by confirmation, then by that awful stretch of time where you know, and you're waiting to decide what to know means. What made it worse, and what Harlow had told almost no one, was that she'd been 12 weeks pregnant when she found the emails. She had not told Trent. She'd sat with that knowledge alone for 2 weeks, long enough to understand that what she felt was not confusion. She was not confused. She was calculating, in the cold and honest way that sometimes follows profound grief, calculating what she needed, what was right, what she could survive, and what she could not. She had the baby, a boy. His name was Elliot, and he was now 14 months old, and he was with her mother tonight in a house in the annex that Harlow had bought herself, with her own money, in her own name. Trent didn't know about Elliot. That was about to change. "You're certain he's here tonight?" Camden asked as they circled toward the cocktail tables along the north wall. "He's a named donor." He had to be. She set down her champagne, picked up a water glass instead. "He co-chaired the foundation 2 years running. He has too much face to lose to skip this." Camden nodded slowly. He was a large, unhurried man. Silver-haired, 62, the kind of physically calm that comes from decades of knowing exactly who you are. He had been the senior partner at a boutique law firm for 30 years before becoming, at his wife's encouragement, a venture philanthropist. His wife, Agatha, was the reason Harlow knew him. They'd been introduced at a Women in Business roundtable 18 months ago, and Camden had become, in the quiet way of genuinely good people, one of the people she trusted most. He was not her boyfriend. The media would probably report otherwise by morning, and that was fine. She watched Trent across the room and she let herself remember, briefly and without sentimentality, what it had been like to love him. He was 44 now. He still wore suits well. He had a mouth she'd once thought was kind. Siobhan said something that made him smile. He nodded, and his hand found her waist, and Harlow watched his eyes slide back across the room to find her. She didn't give him the satisfaction of looking away this time. He held the eye contact for a moment, and then his gaze dropped to her stomach. Old reflex, probably, and then came back to her face, and she saw the precise instant he understood that she didn't look the way a woman looks when she's been destroyed. She looked like she'd been somewhere and done things and come back better. He'd been counting on destroyed. The program began at 8. The foundation's executive director gave a land acknowledgement and a brief address. A video played on the big screens, soft music underneath, children's faces, and the quiet dignity of people helped. Harlow had written half of that program years ago. The foundation had used her template without updating it. She noticed because she'd noticed everything, always, the kind of noticing that becomes a liability when it's pointed in the wrong directions and becomes, slowly, a weapon when redirected. During the applause that followed the video, she felt someone approach from her left. She knew his footsteps. Harlow. She didn't turn immediately. She let one beat pass, then two, and then she turned with exactly the expression she'd decided to wear. Civil, unhurried, and completely unimpressed. "Trent," she said. He'd come without Siobhan, which told her he'd left the woman standing somewhere awkward in order to cross the room. He looked the way men look when they've been imagining a conversation, and the conversation is now happening, and it isn't going the way they'd imagined. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I was invited." She held his gaze. "Was there something you needed?" His jaw moved. I wanted to say hello." "Hello," she said pleasantly, a silence. He glanced toward Camden, who had smoothly angled himself slightly away, giving them conversational privacy while remaining physically present. It was something Camden did naturally. She'd noticed that about him early on. "Who is that?" Trent asked, voice low. Not really a question, more of a reaction he hadn't managed to suppress in time. "Camden Whitmore," she said. "His family's foundation is a co-presenting sponsor tonight. You might recognize the name from the program." Trent recognized the name from 12 Years of Bay Street, and she knew it. The Whitmore group was not a small pond. "Right," he said. He cleared his throat. "You look well." "I am well." Another silence. She could see him recalibrating. He'd come over here expecting something. Contrition maybe, or cold anger, or the brittle performance of dignity that people put on when they're covering grief. He hadn't expected someone who'd simply outgrown him. "We should talk," he said. "At some point. There are some things from the settlement that I think we should discuss." "I have a lawyer for those discussions," she said. "As do you. That's what they're for." Harlow, Trent. She said his name the way you say something when you're setting it down for the last time. "I don't have anything to discuss with you tonight. If your legal team wants to reach out to Petra Calloway's office, she'll respond within 48 hours. He blinked. Petra Calloway was not a name he'd been expecting. Petra Calloway was the senior partner at Calloway Sinclair, and she was, depending on who you asked, either the most formidable family law attorney in Ontario or its most expensive one. Both assessments were correct. "You're working with Calloway?" he said. "I am," Harlow said. "Have been for some time." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at her the way people look at a door that's been locked from the inside, and they've only just understood they don't have a key anymore. "Excuse me," she said. "I should get back." She turned and walked back to Camden, and she did not look over her shoulder. She had hired Petra Calloway 8 months ago, which was approximately 6 months, after Trent had instructed his own legal team to contest the valuation of her contribution to Devereux Capital's founding years. His position, the position his lawyers had put in writing, was that her introductions and facilitation work during those early years had been personal, not professional, and therefore not subject to equitable accounting in the division of marital assets. In other words, what she'd built, she'd apparently done as a wife, not a person. She'd read that letter 3 times. Then she'd called Petra. Petra had listened to the whole story, asked 10 minutes of very precise questions, and then said, "Do you have documentation of the Aldridge introduction? Correspondence, calendar records, anything?" Harlow had said, "I have everything." She did. She'd always been meticulous. Partly personality, partly the professional training. She'd worked in finance long enough to know that what isn't written down doesn't exist. She had emails, meeting minutes, calendar invites, and a paper trail going back 11 years that mapped, with unfortunate clarity for Trent, the exact contribution she had made to every significant client relationship his firm had ever built. She'd been keeping records before she'd known she'd need them. There was one recording in particular, made 2 years before everything fell apart, during an argument in which Trent, frustrated and unguarded, had told her explicitly that Devereux Capital would not exist without what she'd done in those first 3 years. He'd been angry with her about something else at the time, some dinner she'd canceled, and he'd weaponized her contribution as accusation without realizing he was also creating evidence. She'd known, even then, something was shifting. She hadn't known what. She'd kept the recording because she trusted her instincts even when she couldn't yet explain them. Petra, when she heard it, had set down her pen and simply looked at Harlow across the desk for a moment. "He said that on a recorded call?" she asked. "He was on speakerphone. I was making notes from another meeting. He didn't know it was recording." Petra had smiled, very slightly, the way someone smiles when the case has just changed shape. The dinner was plated at 9. Harlow found herself at table 11, beside a documentary filmmaker named Yolande who wanted to talk about indigenous housing policy and a retired senator from Manitoba who had opinions about everything. She was grateful for both of them. Trent was at table 4, the named donor table, which was closer to the front and had better centerpieces. She didn't need to see him to know he'd spent the first course watching her. At some point during the main, Camden leaned over and said, very quietly, "His date doesn't look pleased with him." Harlow didn't glance over. She figured out why he crossed the room, probably. "Is she looking at me?" A pause. "She's looking at you the way someone looks at a math problem they can't solve." Harlow picked up her fork. Let her look. She'd spent a long time being angry at Siobhan Price. That season had passed. The woman was 29 and had fallen for a man who'd told her, presumably some version of a story about a marriage that was already over, already cold, already hollow. That's always the story. Harlow didn't know if Siobhan had believed it entirely or only enough, but it didn't matter anymore. She wasn't the crime. She was a symptom. The crime was that Trent had taken 12 years of partnership and decided, when it had served its purpose, that it had never been equal. That she had never been equal. That was the thing she'd had to metabolize slowly, over months, like something toxic. Not the betrayal. She could grieve betrayal. She'd grieved it, but the revision, the retroactive rewriting of what they'd been. The suggestion, implicit in his lawyer's filings, that she had been a helpmate and a wife and nothing more, and that this was obvious, and that she should have known it all along. She had not known it all along, and she was going to make sure the record reflected that. After dinner, there was a live auction. Harlow bid on 2 items, a cottage weekend package and a set of indigenous art prints, and won one of them, the prints. She wrote the check without thinking twice. It was during the dessert course that Trent appeared again. She heard him rather than saw him, the chair scraping beside her as the documentary filmmaker stepped away to find the bathroom, and then his voice lower, now more controlled than earlier. "Can I sit for a moment?" She considered saying no. She let him sit. "Siobhan doesn't know I'm here," he said. It sounded like a confession. "Okay," Harlow said. "I've been thinking," he started. Specifically, he turned his glass on the tablecloth. 3 years of marriage counseling, which they'd never actually done, might have taught him to say what he meant directly. Instead, he said, about whether things went the way they should have. She looked at him. "They went the way you chose. I made mistakes," he said. It was the closest he'd ever come to saying so, and she heard what it cost him, and she felt almost nothing. That absence of feeling, that was the clearest sign of how far she'd come. "I believe you believe that," she said. "Harlow, Trent, listen to me." She set her dessert fork down. "Whatever you've come over here to say, whether it's an apology, or a negotiation, or something in between, I want you to know that I don't need it. I'm not angry at you. I'm not waiting for anything from you. I've built a life that I'm proud of, and I've done that on my own, and there is nothing you have the power to give me or take from me right now that would change how I feel about any of it." He was quiet. "The legal process will resolve the asset question," she continued. "Petra's office will handle it. I trust that process. Beyond that, we don't have anything else to discuss." He was still looking at her as though she were someone he recognized but couldn't quite place. That was the version of her that had unsettled him when she walked in tonight. Not because she was dressed well or because she was with Camden Whitmore, but because she was unmistakably herself, without apology, without performance, without any of the grief he'd expected her to still be carrying on his behalf. "I didn't know you were working with Calloway," he said again, quieter this time. "I know," she said. "I let your team believe I was still with Renner and Associates." A pause. "That was intentional, it was." He looked at the tablecloth. "You've been planning this for a while." "I've been protecting myself for a while," she said. "Which isn't the same thing, though I understand why it might feel that way from where you're sitting." He got up slowly, the way people get up when they realize a conversation has ended in a different place than they'd thought it would. "I do regret it," he said. "I want you to know that." "Good night, Trent," she said gently, and he left. The gala wound down around 11. Camden brought her coat. The valet pulled the car around, and they stood on Front Street under the October cold, with their breath-making clouds, and she felt the night air on her face and thought about Elliot, who would be asleep by now in the blue room at her mother's, one arm thrown over the stuffed rabbit that went everywhere with him. "How are you doing?" Camden said. Not a question exactly. "Honestly." She wrapped her scarf tighter. "Better than I thought." He looked like he'd seen a ghost. He probably had. She watched a cab pull out of the hotel driveway. The version of me he thought he'd left behind. Camden had known about Elliot for 4 months. He'd been the third person she'd told, after her mother and Petra. He'd listened, asked nothing she didn't want to answer, and then offered to accompany her tonight because she'd mentioned, almost in passing, that she dreaded the possibility of walking into that room alone. He'd shown up in a rented tuxedo and said, "I've been to worse parties. At least the cause is good." She'd told him, in the car on the way here, that she wasn't sure what she wanted out of the evening, that she wasn't looking for a scene or a confrontation, that she mostly just wanted Trent to see her. Not devastated, not rebuilt in some tidy narrative arc, just her, as she was, continuing. "Did he see that?" Camden asked now. She considered it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think he did." The car arrived and she got in, and somewhere across town her son was sleeping, and the legal case was in capable hands, and the business she'd quietly registered 18 months ago, Harlow Sinclair Advisory Partners, had just signed its third institutional client. She hadn't told Trent any of that. She hadn't needed to. Some things didn't require an audience. 3 weeks after the gala, Trent's legal team made a substantially revised offer. Petra called at 8:47 in the morning, while Harlow was feeding Elliot scrambled eggs in the kitchen of the annex house. The boy had his father's eyes and her mother's patience, and he was examining the eggs with the concentrated skepticism of someone deciding whether to trust them. "They've revised the capital contribution figure," Petra said, "significantly upward. They've also withdrawn the argument about the Aldridge relationship being personal in nature." Harlow set Elliot's spoon down. "Why now?" "Because," Petra said, and she could hear the satisfaction in the lawyer's voice. 2 days ago, someone on Trent's team went back through discovery materials and found the 2019 call recording. They've known what's in it for 48 hours. This is them recalibrating before it comes out in proceedings. Harlow exhaled slowly. "The revised offer is fair," Petra continued. "It's not everything, but it's honest. Given timeline and cost, I think you take it seriously. But you don't have to decide today." "I know," Harlow said. "Send it over and I'll read it tonight." She hung up. Elliot looked at her with mild expectation. "Sorry, baby," she said. "Where were we?" She offered him the spoon. He accepted it with the gravity of someone who has learned to be patient. She accepted the offer 17 days later, after 2 rounds of revision and 1 amendment regarding the firm's intellectual property categorization. Petra shook her hand. The settlement was signed and filed. Harlow stood outside Petra's office building on Bay Street in the gray November light, and felt the thing that she hadn't been sure she'd be able to feel. Done. Not healed, exactly. Not unchanged. But done in the clean and honest sense, the way a chapter feels when you've actually finished it, rather than just stopped reading. She called her mother. She called her closest friend from university. She walked to a nearby cafe and ordered a cortado, and sat by the window and watched the street for 20 minutes, not thinking anything in particular, just present. That evening, she picked up Elliot from daycare herself, which she tried to do on Fridays. He was in the entry of the center with his jacket half on and his boots on the wrong feet, talking with great animation to a child who may or may not have been listening. When he saw her, he stopped mid-sentence and ran. She caught him and lifted him up, and he smelled like paint and crackers, and she held on for a moment longer than she usually did. "Hi, baby," she said. "Hi, Mama," he said, already patting her face with one hand in the way he had, checking that she was really there. She was really there. That was enough. More than enough. That was, if she was being honest with herself, standing in the doorway of a daycare on a Friday in November, with dried paint on her blazer, and a child who was removing her earring without any awareness that this was happening. Exactly what she had wanted when she had wanted things that were simple and true. She hadn't built this because of what Trent had done to her. She'd built it because of who she was, and who she'd always been, even when someone else had failed to see it. She didn't need him to see it now. She just needed to keep going. And she did.